Hey, it's Steve. In this video, we're going to take a look at how I built this fun little Z-scale layout. Let's watch. Okay, so I needed an 18 by 24 inch base to fit the oval of Z-scale track I was going to have for this project. And I found a 24 inch diameter tabletop board in the garage and decided to use that. So I cut off a few inches on each side with my circular saw to get that roughly 18 by 24 inch size, and took my orbital sander and rounded over the edges of those cut sides to pretty much match the other edges on this board. So with that done, I stacked up a couple layers of 1-inch foam board on the layout base, took it over to my hot wire cutter, and used that wood base as a guide to cut the ovals of foam the same size. Since I didn't actually have the track yet with the set, what I did was make up the simple layout plan using AnyRail, and then printed everything out and taped the pages together, and then cut out the actual tracks. I just had that loop of paper that I could tape onto the foam board and then work around that and kind of pretend that that paper was the actual track. So with the paper on there, I could more or less confidently cut all the foam away around the edges and know that the track was going to fit okay when I actually received it. And then I carved out the area where I planned to have the river. I decided I didn't actually want to have a tunnel on this layout, so I had more areas to kind of video trains and do pictures and that kind of thing from with different scenery backgrounds. And so I just made a sort of central mountain area that kind of would serve as a view block for this little layout. And so I cut those areas out again with my hot wire cutter and kind of just produced a stack of foam discs to create that mountain. Now, I didn't have enough foam to just do solid pieces of foam for each level, and so I had to make up all the third and fourth and fifth layer from 2 pieces each for each level, but I cut all those to size so I had my multiple levels of foam to create my mountain. And then I applied glue to the bottom of each of those layers and stacked them up, and I also used several wood screws on each layer of foam to hold everything securely in place while the glue dried. And you don't need to do that. I just do that because it allows me to kind of continue working without waiting for the glue to dry, since the screws will hold everything in place and then the glue will eventually firmly and permanently bond everything together. So with the foam base done, I went on to doing the simple wiring, and so all I had to do was drill a hole through the foam where I plan to have the wires come into the layout, have that hole go into the wood base as well, and then I drilled a horizontal hole through the edge where I plan to install the plug, and then I just ran the wires for that plug through the hole and hammered in the plug into the wood. Didn't need to use any adhesive at all since it was a tight and secure fit. And then I just stripped the wires that I had pushed through the hole so I could solder on the connector to the Roku hand track. But you can't use a connector directly on the curved tracks, only the straight tracks. So I eventually just had to solder on the wires to the track anyway. So I didn't really need to solder on this connector at this point, but nonetheless, I did need smaller and thinner wires because the thicker gauge wire from the plug would have been really too unwieldy to try to solder directly to the very small rails on the Z-scale track. But anyway, once I had that plug soldered on, I also soldered on the connector plug for the male side and had that ready to go to plug into the controller. So once I actually had the track, I could connect that, plug it into the controller, and be ready to run some trains. The next step on the scenery was to cover everything in a layer of Sculptamold, at least that central river and mountain area. I had actually covered the bottom area of the river just with plain blue masking tape, so when I applied the Sculptamold there, it wouldn't just go directly through the hole there, and I had something to sort of serve as a temporary base. And then I covered all the central mountain area with a couple batches of Sculptamold, just enough to cover everything, fill in all the gaps in the foam, and could serve as that scenery base. Because it was very humid in the garage, it was taking quite a while to dry, and so there was still some wet areas even the next day, and so I just took it outside, put it in the sun, and that really helped it dry very quickly. So once that plaster was dry, I just took some plain brown paint that I had and painted the entire layout base that brown color to serve as a nice undercoat for all the scenery materials. And then I decided to really just move straight on to doing scenery. I was trying to do this layout project very quickly. And so with the paint still wet, I just poured on some white glue and kind of painted that into the actual brown paint. So you had a combination of paint and glue on the entire layout. So then I took some blended turf from Woodland Scenics and sprinkled that over the entire layout base, as well as some of my dirt ballast mix and some other jars of dirt and small stones that I had, and applied those into the river area with the ground foam placed everywhere else on the layout. So that mixture of glue and paint really helped to adhere everything securely to the layout base. But once I did finish getting all the scenery materials, at least those base materials applied to the foam base, I went ahead and sprayed everything down with some rubbing alcohol and then soaked everything with a diluted mix of matte medium. So you had the glue on the bottom, then I had glue on top, and so this would be a very secure scenery base for moving this layout around, not really much risk of anything coming off at all. So while that was drying, I went ahead and mixed all the foliage I planned to use for the forested area of this layout. Now, I was planning on getting a CSX Z-scale train set, and so I wanted something to look kind of like Pennsylvania, very dense forested hills, but it's Z-scale, so you can kind of get away without using actual trees. And so I took clump foliage from Woodland Scenics. I took the olive green, light green, and medium green, along with another type of foliage material from a different vendor that I had as well. Mixed all those together in a box just so I could have, a nice mixture of colors and textures with all that. And so that is what I used to actually coat the entire layout. So then very early on a Saturday morning, I took the layout outside on the back patio, put it on some cardboard, and then mixed up some white glue and some tacky glue together to kind of serve as a base, and started working on attaching clumps of foliage. So this took a while here, but eventually I did get the entire layout coated with the clump foliage, but I really still wanted more layers of texture than just that clumpy foam stuff. And so I did take a couple boxes of the fine leaf material. This is basically pieces of sea foam, the super tree type material that's coated in flocking, which I basically just took little pieces. I didn't glue any of the individual pieces in as I put them in. I just put them in without any glue. So once I had all those pieces in place, I soaked everything again with a diluted mix of matte medium, and that really helped to eventually secure everything tightly together once it all dried. So once everything was more or less dry, I just put a bunch of glue on that wood layout base and then put on that finished scenery top onto that wood base. And to help secure everything in place, I just took a bunch of clamps, clamped everything together all the way around the edges of the layout. And then again, like I like to do, I added some wood screws everywhere as well, so I could also continue working without having to wait for the glue to fully dry. Luckily, the same day, the track actually arrived in the mail. And so I put it on the workbench, got the track connected together along with the bridge section that I had purchased as well, and pretty much put that in place on the layout and just kind of trimming things where I needed to trim them so everything would fit well. The main area I had to work on was the actual area where the bridge was in place, because it did extend below the rail surface more than the rest of the track roadbed did. And so I had to cut away more of the foam on the layout base so it would kind of sit flat and flush with the rest of the layout. So now, before I could actually glue down the track to the layout, I did need a way to actually supply power to the track. And again, that connector that comes with the Rokugan track will only connect to the straight pieces, not to the curved pieces. And so I just cut the connector off and drilled some small holes through the roadbed itself and fed those small wires up through the plastic roadbed next to the rails. And so that would eventually allow me to solder those wires to the sides of the rail in that location. But once I had those holes drilled and the wires going through the holes, I was able to glue down the track. And for this, I just used some tacky glue, just running a bead of glue all around the perimeter of the layout where the track was to be put in place. I pressed the track down, added some weight, and then I decided to just use clamps like before and clamp the track in place. So with the tacky glue, things did dry pretty quickly, and I was ready to go to solder the wires in place. So all I had to do was trim the wires down so they were pretty short. But anyway, I got the insulation stripped off the first wire. I applied some solder to the wire, and then I applied some solder to the rail. And then I took a screwdriver to hold the wire up against the rail, and then I could just apply heat with a soldering iron, and it would melt the solder on both the rail and the wire. And then pretty much everything was secure after that. Same thing with the second wire, cut and then stripped the wire, applied solder to the track and the wire. And then again, just using a small screwdriver, I held the wire up against the track while I applied heat and waited till everything melted. And then I was good to go there and had both wires secured to the rails. So at this point I was ready to test since I had power to the tracks, and so I plugged in my battery powered controller, put the small CSX GP30 on the track and gave it a test run here, and things worked pretty well. I hadn't cleaned anything yet, so it wasn't quite as smooth as it could be. Plus, this was the very first time this locomotive had been run, so it wasn't really broken in yet, but still it ran pretty well. And you can see here just the simple tests that I had, just running it around for a little bit to make sure I had no problems with the track in terms of unevenness or anything that had to be fixed, but things looked good. So I went on to finishing the scenery work. I decided to add some more clump foliage in places to kind of fill things in. So I just took my tacky glue, added glue here and there, as well as additional clumps of the ground foam until everything looked good. Next, it was on to ballasting. And so like I always do, I just ran a bead of white glue along the edges of the rail and then poured on my usual mix of ballast that I use on my projects, which again is a mix of many types of ballast. I kind of just keep buying bags of ballast as my container of ballast gets low and mix them together. So I really have like 4 or 5 different kinds of ballast mixed together. They're all similar shades of gray, but they all vary a little bit in color. I poured on the ballast with a spoon and then took a small brush and tried to even everything out, getting as much as I could away from the rails itself. And I tried to expose most of the ties. So once I had that section of track smoothed out, I sprayed everything down with rubbing alcohol and then soaked everything with, again, that diluted mix of matte medium. Then it was just a matter of going on to the other sections of the layout, kind of working in about quarter sections of this loop of track, doing each of those, and then moving on to the following section until I had the entire loop of track fully ballasted. And you can see here pretty much the ballasted area covered almost the entire width of the space I had left between the trees. So that worked out pretty nicely. So now you can see here how everything looked with all the trees, all the ballast done, and the only thing left to do at this point was to add the water. So to do the water, I used some Envirotex 2-part epoxy along with some blue color here from Woodland Scenics. And so I took 2 paper cups, filled up one about halfway with the resin and one about halfway with the hardener, and then added a little bit more resin to make sure they were both about equal. Then I just poured the resin into the hardener, mixed those together, and then I poured that mix back into the cup that had the resin, again, mixed things up. And so once I had done that back and forth a few times, I took the bottle of blue dye and put a few drops in there just to add a little bit of color to the water. And so while it looks pretty blue in the cup, because the actual layer of resin in the creek is going to be fairly thin, it's only going to be a very subtle looking blue color, as you'll see here in a minute. So the last step here was to create a dam so everything wouldn't just roll out the edge of the layout onto the floor. So I applied some masking tape, and then I took some silicone caulk and applied a bead of caulk along the edge of the layout. I didn't really wait for that caulk to dry. I figured it would just be sticky enough and it would kind of help fill in that gap that the resin wouldn't leak out. And for the most part, that was true. A little bit leaked out when I poured it, but it worked pretty well. Then I just poured on the resin along the riverbed, kind of going from the middle towards each edge back and forth. And you can kind of just see how that sort of gradually self-leveled as I poured everything on. Now, because I didn't want everything to pool up towards the bridge, I actually raised the bridge area of the layout up on a coaster and then on some paper towels to just kind of make it a little bit higher than the rest of the layout, so more of the water would kind of roll back towards the head of the river and make sure I had a actual coating of resin on the entire river area. So it worked out pretty well. You can see here in the deeper areas here towards the front that there is a very slight bluish greenish cast to the water, and I thought that looked pretty good. But overall, you can kind of see how that looked before it dried. And like I usually do, I just use a lighter to kind of pop any bubbles after a while that rose to the surface. And you can just breathe on it as well, which is safer so you don't burn down your forest and create a forest fire on your little layout. But as long as you're careful, it works pretty well and gets all the bubbles pop pretty quickly. So once I was pretty sure the resin was dry and afterwards it wasn't going to start flowing anymore on me, I pulled away the tape and cut away the silicone caulk that I had put along the edge. Now that gave me kind of a weird rough edge to the actual resin, so I kind of cut that so I had a smooth beveled edge, but that cut edge was pretty obvious, so I touched up any of the nicks I had made with some brown paint, and then I came back with some gloss varnish and painted that along the cut edge of the resin. And that turned the rough looking kind of opaque edge of the resin layer clear again, and so it looked pretty good. So the only thing left to do at this point was to weather the track. So I just took some dark gray pan pastel and just kind of brushed that onto the track. And even though you're going to remove some of it when you're cleaning the track, most of it, kind of settles down there into the ballast and will kind of bond with it pretty well. And it's not really going to be too much of a problem long term. But anyway, just dirtied up the track a little bit, gave it the look of oil stains and that kind of thing, and just made it look a little bit less uniform. And to kind of help break up some of the darker splotches, I just took a larger paintbrush and really kind of just scrubbed along there to kind of help blend in the edges of those darker stains so it looked a little bit more blended in. But anyway, that wrapped up the construction, and so then it was time to run some trains. So anyway, this was a fun project to do. It's always fun building these little tiny layouts like this that you can put on a desk, on a file cabinet, end table, that kind of thing, where you don't have a lot of space, but you want a small layout there so you can watch a train run. So this worked out really well, I think. It's battery powered, so I can put it anywhere I want. But this was a fun project to do. It was a really fast build. I probably spent a total of maybe 10 hours building it, so not very long. And I used mostly materials I already had on hand in the garage here. So, other than the track, I really didn't spend much on it in terms of actually building this. And it's just kind of a nice break from doing other stuff. So instead of doing wiring on my end scale layout that I'm building, I just did a quick build like this, got to do some scenery, have some fun with it. And it was a nice, enjoyable, fast project. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching how I built this little layout. But that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.